What up, what up, what up? It's your girl Tania, aka the Cool Auntie, and this is the Cool Auntie podcast. I'm back. Your good sis, your good auntie was out in Costa Rica this past week, living her best life, and that I did. Shout out to y'all for the safe travel wishes and for indulging me on the socials, because I cut up a little bit, just a little bit. But now I'm back to my regular, boring, schmoring life. But I really did enjoy myself. It was a beep getting out of the country. I'm going to let y'all know right now, if you are traveling in the midst of the pandemic, especially international travel was already a lengthy process because you got to go through customs and get clearances and some of those things. But with that extra layer of the pandemic, I got one word for you, honey: raggedy. Okay, it was just raggedy. It was raggedy going and raggedy, even raggedy-er coming back, y'all. It was just straight up raggedy. But the experience in Costa Rica itself was super, super amazing. Fun fact: so I actually have a Spanish degree. No one has people don't realize that, but I have a Spanish degree, and so something about going to Costa Rica, I've always been very insecure about being able to speak Spanish fluently. Just because, you always think you're great in America, if you go somewhere else and you're like, I don't know shit, right? And so, mind you, in my profession, I don't encounter as many Spanish-speaking individuals as I would like, although it is very helpful to have. And so, getting to go to Costa Rica, and y'all, honey, they understood me. They understood your girl. Okay, I had to call my mom, and one of my best friends is Salvadorian, and so her mom is always putting me to the test with my Spanish. She's actually the only one I can count on once a year, my friend Monica's mom, to put me to the test. But outside of her mom, I barely had to speak it, and so I was so excited. Just to there's so many talents and skills that we learn when we're younger, and we think, oh, they're gone. But what I love about us is that when it's time to show up, we show up. Right, especially when it's God-given. And so it was so cool to be able to travel in the midst of the pandemic. I recognize my privilege and my blessings in that, but the people there are so dope. They're so much different than we are. And mind you, I went there with a bunch of people who were from the Northeast. And so we all have this impatience, loud, fast-moving, assertiveness about us. And so to go to Costa Rica and just to see they're literally the complete opposite of us. So we went for a friend of mine's birthday. And so one of the nights, a couple of nights, we had a chef. And so, or chefs, plural, and they were so great. If you ever go to Costa Rica, I got some crazy homies out there. So if you ever go, you got to tell me so I can send you to them. I told them I would come back. They showed me nothing but love out there. I was la reina out there, okay? That means queen, if you're not familiar with Spanish. But your girl was la reina out there, and I loved it so much. So if you ever go to Costa Rica and you fly into Liberia Airport, let me know. I know some really, really great people. But one of our chefs, his name was Carlos, and they were so great. Shout out to Carlos and Tony, okay? And the food was bomb. We were talking to Carlos, and we found out that Carlos had actually spent a few years living in America. I think he said he was in Connecticut, and so no shade to Connecticut. Anybody who's listening who's from Connecticut, I have a couple of friends from Boston. No shade, but of all the places to be in the U.S., you chose Connecticut, dog. Whatever. But he was telling us that he did spend a few years in America, but he ended up coming back. And we were like that's crazy. Why? Because we assume, I guess because of the narrative that gets painted in America, we assume that everybody who comes wants to stay, And he was and he said something so profound, and we were all mind you, we were all drinking and that's a good point. He was saying that compared to Costa Rica, America does have, more money, more resources, more opportunity. He said, but it's so fast paced and it's so hectic and there's so much weight that you carry that the people who live there don't get to enjoy it. Like, I was like, wow, he's so right. Like, compared to Costa Rica, like, I believe like $1 of ours is $2 to them, right? As far as the currency. I think that's about right. But like everyone there is just so lax. They're never in a rush. They're never impatient. Even when we were impatient with them, they were always just super chill, super la da da da. And we're like, it was just so peaceful to watch and to be a part of. But it's so different from America, right? It's so different from being here. And he's right. Like y'all saw how exhausted I was last week getting ready to go to the trip. I came back and literally I came back to just hitting the ground running with all my businesses. And like, he's right. And I'm like, yo, like, he's so right. We're all in this pursuit of this American dream, and just the way society is set up, we're constantly going. And so when I think back to what we were talking about last week and just reflecting on like this, why am I here? Who am I? Right? We ask these questions, and we have these questions as young as I want to say, like, it's being a toddler, even an adolescent. Maybe I'll say adolescent. I don't know if toddlers are necessarily thinking about that, but I'll say even like as far as being an adolescent, we're thinking about these things, but because life is moving so fast, right? Because we don't stop. Just because you don't know the answer, you don't get an extra day, right? You don't get more time to figure it out. You're having to figure it out while still living your life. And that is a lot of stress. But it was something that I didn't really think about until Carlos brought it up. And so I guess even thinking about that, first and foremost, I am loving how much y'all are responding to the re-up. From just the comments under posts and clips to DMs. Y'all really do send DMs. Like when I be telling y'all to talk to me, y'all really do send them. And it's so crazy. And I love them. Like I love when people talk to me, especially when like I get to see who's listening, because it doesn't really tell me, all I have are numbers and metrics, but I never really get to know who's listening. And so when y'all talk back to me, I get to know who you are. I think when people meet me or when you see me in person, people assume that I don't like to be bothered and I don't like to talk. And that's not true. That's not true. My friends will tell you that, and that's bullshit, okay? And that's it. I don't like to be bothered with bullshit, okay? Now, if you have things of substance to say to me, if we're pouring into each other, if we're being fed spiritually, if our conversation is productive, if it's solution oriented, if it's something good coming out of it, you'll never bother me. But to call me about gossip, to call me about bullshit, yeah, I'm taking your ass to voicemail. Like, I ain't got time for that. But so I wanted to say that I do appreciate y'all talking back to me, because I just love to hear from y'all. I love to talk. I love to connect. And so thank y'all for that. And keep them coming. I got something in tune for y'all too. So y'all stay tuned for that. But I noticed that in the comments, a lot of conversations that I had, whether it be in my story or under post or even some of the DMs that I got from last week, there was a commonality again about people just being obsessed with doing, right? What they should be doing, what they feel like they're supposed to do. And it's crazy because I think, like I mentioned last week, is that before God ever reveals what you should be doing, I think he always reveals who you are. And it's crazy because just from all the things that I was consuming this past week, from sermons to other podcasts that I listen to books that I read, and just doing my everyday research and just talking to folks, there was so much confirmation in it. So I'm super excited about today and getting ready to dive in. And so the first thing that I want to talk about, though, is really challenging this idea that purpose is about doing, because I don't necessarily feel like it is. And after research and after hearing, again, all that confirmation, it's really not, right? And that purpose is less about doing and more about being. I was listening to a sermon, and the way it's so crazy because it's been in my face this whole time, but when he said it, I'm like, it makes sense. It's like even the term human being, it's not human doing, it's human being, because it's idea of just being. And that's whether you're looking at it in a scientific lens or a spiritual lens. I said scientific. That has to be a word, a merge of the two. We're gonna coin that. But whether you're looking at it in a natural lens or a spiritual lens, it's essentially the same thing. I even went to, I'm a firm believer in trying to confirm things in the word first. I want to know what God says about it. But even when I think about some of the most powerful stories in the Bible, they were about being. When you think about Mary and Martha, right? If you ever heard the story about when Jesus comes to visit Mary and Martha, Martha gets mad because all Mary is doing is sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to him and talking to him. Right. And when she confronts Jesus about it, he's like, no, Mary's doing what she's supposed to do. She's being. You're doing. She's being. And even though you're doing is good, she's doing what she's supposed to be doing, which is being. Right. I think about Jesus walking on water. Right. In that story, we see both Peter walking on water and Jesus walking on water. But if you look at that story, especially if you read it from the different gospels, because that story is told from several different lenses. When you look at it, it shows the power. I think that for me, I feel like sometimes the lesson in that is that many a times we equate getting to our destination as our ability to row, right? And that story about Jesus walking on water, it says that the disciples were at least 3 miles out by the time Jesus got to them. And Jesus was back praying. So basically in that scenario, he's like, listen, you spend more time with me and you'll get to where you got to go faster than you trying to do it the natural way and in your own strength and in your own might, right? They had 12 people on a boat rowing, and Jesus, all he had to do was walk out on the water, right? Even Peter and Jesus both walked on water. Jesus was able to walk long term. Peter walked short term. A lot of it had to do with Jesus taking the time to be with God versus just doing for God or doing with God, right? I think about even Moses. If you know about Moses, one of the reasons why God got mad at Moses is because God told Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses hit the rock out of frustration. And God's like, I ain't asked you to do. I asked you to say, I asked you to be. And you out here doing, messing it all up, right? I even think about the story that I'm always bringing to y'all. One of my favorite stories in the Bible, and this idea of Jacob, right? Mind you, Jacob is the father. He's a descendant, we're all descendants of Jacob, right? The children of Israel, right? And this idea of when Jacob was wrestling with himself, that was such a pivotal moment in his spirituality and in his growth. And then when he was doing it, the first question that God asked him is, what's your name? He didn't ask what you did. He didn't ask what you did in the past. He didn't ask what you're doing now. He asked, what is your name? Because there's power in who you are. But more importantly, there's power in how you see us and how you see yourself. Right? I even think about how we're created, right? I think if it was really about us doing, right, he would have made us all the same because we could do the same things, right? If we was about just being teachers, we could all teach the same. If it was about being an artist or being a lawyer, a doctor, a cat, whatever it might be, if it was about just doing, we didn't have to be different. But I think there's so much power in the fact that God was so intentional with making us different and making us unique. I think because he knew that our true significance, right, the true impact that we were going to have in this world is being. It's just a state of being. And you're like, okay, Tania, that makes sense. But what does it mean to be? Right? And think about that. What does that mean to be? To be is your sense of self. Who are you? Again, going back to that magical question of who are you? And so I know we went over this last week, so I'm not going to dive too deep into it. But I want to make sure that I do a quick review. Just this idea, many times when we think about this idea of self, we equate it to being this one singular thing. But in fact, who you are as a person and how you see you is layered, right? And it's actually 4 different parts. Self-knowledge, self-concept, self-esteem, and social self, right? And so as a quick refresher, I can use an example with, Father's Day is next week. And I have been very open and transparent about my own journey as it relates to fatherhood and me seeing God as my father and even my own relationship with my natural father, right? And so in this sense, right, how fatherhood or my lack thereof plays a role in who I am. right? And so self-knowledge is me acknowledging that, number one, I did not have a father in the home growing up, right? That's self-knowledge. It's just the fact, what I know about me. So I know that I did not have a father, an active father, a father period in my home growing up, right? Number two to that is self-concept, right? It's how I interpret that. And so I'll be fully transparent in that growing up, I interpret that as he didn't want me. My father did not want me. Granted, in hindsight, and now that I've had the ability to talk to him as an adult, I know that wasn't the case. However, I can acknowledge that throughout the course of my life up until recently, my self-concept was my father did not want me, right? Which leads to self-esteem, in which over the years it played out as in, well, my own father didn't want me, right? So now my self-esteem is I am not worthy of being wanted. I'm not worthy of love, right? So you see how they all play a part, right? This idea of self-knowledge influences self-concept, and your self-concept influences self-esteem, which leads to social self, right? How I show up with people. And so because I didn't have a father in my home, and I interpreted that as he didn't want me, and I felt like I wasn't worthy of love or being wanted in the social settings, there's two different components there. First is a half of me that had a natural, and in some ways still does, has a natural mistrust of men, right? Because they have proven to be not dependable, right? But then also in my social self is because I didn't always feel worthy of being loved, I overcompensated in relationships where I was constantly pouring with the hopes that someone would want to pour back into me and would see me worthy. Right. And so all of those things, and although they're all encompassing on this idea of self-identity, even though it plays out in four different components in four different ways. And that's so hard it's so important to understand the different categories and understanding the different components, because whenever you don't have a clear understanding of those, you begin to misdiagnose yourself, right? You start confusing feelings and facts, or you're internalizing the wrong thing. So for example, the idea of not being worthy, that's not actually fact. That was only a feeling that came from an interpretation of a fact, right? It's not actually fact. But many of us are walking around with that's just the way I am. That's just the way it is. And we're internalizing some of these unhealthy behaviors and attitudes, not because they're actually true, but because we misdiagnosed what they were. Right. And we see it so much. And we call it, and it's been, I think in culture now, we call it toxicity. But that's really where it comes from. Toxicity is like, it's just unhealthy attitudes and dispositions and behaviors. That's what toxicity is, right? You know how when you meet a person or you see a person and you watch how they react to a thing or respond to a person, and you ask them like, ooh, like, who hurt you? Like you could just feel the bitterness. You could smell it. You could sense it. Like, yo, like, what's up? And sometimes you can see it on people close to you, but also I even see it in culture. And I'm not going to lie that as I've grown in my head, and I've invested more into like my mental and my emotional and physical, this is just my overall well-being and my health. Some things are triggering in culture. So a personal example, this idea of grace. When I first started walking into this space of grace, friends, colleagues, even culture did not agree with grace because we're not really taught grace. We're taught, like and actually as a reason to that is a reason why. So even like now, I don't even share intimate details of my romantic relationships for that very reason. Right? Because I'd be dating a person, and me, I'm just because I do people work, like you gotta think I'm a coach. And so my job is to always see the best in people all the time. And so I'd be dating someone and they do something and it might hurt my feelings. I might be upset, but I'm just very forgiving because I just assume that, we all mess up. We all make mistakes. You didn't know until you knew, those things. And so I talk to one of my friends and I be trying to explain like, I'm going to give him grace and I'm going to talk to him about this. And they'd be like, F that MFer. If he wanted to do it, he would have did it. And then I'm like, whoa, baby. Who hurt you? Why we gotta go there? How do you know that he know what he did? How do you know that he meant it on purpose? Like, you don't know. But what's coming out, it's not that people necessarily always feel that way. Many a times it's just them misdiagnosing things. And so they're adopting attitudes and behaviors and dispositions that are unhealthy and values that are unhealthy, not because they want to, but because it's just how life panned out for them. And so it doesn't mean that, again, they do get a level of grace for that, of course. Now, mind you, what happens to you isn't your responsibility. However, your healing is your responsibility. So I'm not taking that away from them. But this idea of grace, it makes more sense when you understand some of the nuances behind some of these things, right? And so I guess with that being said, okay, Tania, I get it. There's healthy and unhealthy. Like, what is that and how do I know the difference, right? Because I think in our own way, like, no one's fully healthy in every single area. Like, even me. I think a common misperception about, like, people who work in this industry who are mental health counselors and therapists and coaches and all these things, people assume that we don't have coaches and we don't have therapists. Therapists have therapists, right? Even though we get where people are licensed in this area, everyone still has things they're working on. So even for me, I know I'm an open book about my journey, because I think that's what makes me a great coach, is that I own it. It's like, even in those 4 different areas, I am not going to 100% say that I am always fully healthy in all 4. Right? So, for example, self-esteem right now, it's super high because I just lost over 50 pounds. But 2 years ago, when I was still doing this work, but I was a few pounds heavier, my self-esteem was not as high as it is right now. And so again, even for you, and this idea of how do I reach ultimate health, like health and what it means to be well in these areas, it's going to vary, and it's not always going to be perfect all the time. And so today's conversation, I really okay, Tania, why? This all makes sense, but why? I wanted to walk folks through what the different stages of development looks like as it relates to identity. Because again, it's like one of those things where it's almost like school, right? This idea of, in school, there's a rubric, right, where you understand. So when you get something wrong, when you get a bad grade, when you don't do a thing right, you have something to refer to that tells you the answer, right? When it comes to becoming, right, this idea of becoming, that's all identity is becoming. There's no rubric for that anywhere. So many a times we're becoming, but you don't always know if what you're becoming and who you are becoming is what you're supposed to be becoming. Right. And so granted, I'm not here to tell you what you're supposed to be doing, because for me, I'm a firm believer that purpose is given and is given by God. Identity is given and is given by God. So I never want to step in and say, oh, this is what it is. However, I do think that there's a level to which God has given us and deposited understanding and revelation about ourselves to us. That's why therapy works. Right. Again, as a coach, as a coach, but even when dealing with therapy, most of the time we're not giving you the answers. We're holding the mirror up so that you can give yourselves the answers, right? Because I believe that through experience and just through the Holy Spirit and through whatever we want to call it, intuition, you have the answers. And so I'm not saying here are the answers, but I want to at least give you a sense of what development looks like so you know what to look for. And just kind of what to be mindful of. And so definitely bear with me. Most of you tend to listen. I know that most people opt into the audio version of this podcast, which I also love. But for those of you who tend to watch, I do have a visual behind me, which I'm going to explain to you. For those who are not watching, stay tuned, because you're going to see some more visuals. I have a little surprise / gift for folks who are really locked into this series, which I'll announce next week. But in that same capacity, right, let's dive in, let's get started. And so the first thing I want to acknowledge that when it comes to those 4 areas, right, so remember how I mentioned last week about how even though you have those 4 different components, right, in each of them, I want you to imagine 3 versions of yourself, right? So as it relates to self-knowledge, there's what you know about the past you, the current, the present you, and the future you, and they're always different. And so I think I told you last week to think about those 12 boxes, Okay? And then I want you to take each of those 12 boxes and divide it into 4. Hence this graphic behind me, right? That's how layered and nuanced identity is. You're like, okay, Tania, so if you don't have it down pat, if you don't understand it fully, now you can give yourself some more grace because it's so layered. Right? And so right now I want to focus, I kind of want to step away from the whole past, present, future you thing. Definitely a thing for you to think about on your own, but I want to just focus on what does development look like in each of the 4 components. And then I believe that later you all can go back and kind of piece together what does past, present, and you look like developmentally in each of those 4 components. Okay? And so the first thing to recognize is that the way development works is almost like a hereditary trait chart. Remember how when you were in health class or science, one of those classes that I barely made it through? Science is not my subject. Remember when they had you like think about, like talking about like genes and how certain children and certain families adopt certain genes from their parents, and how you had the big letters and the little letters, and how depending on the dominant and recessive traits, depending on how they panned out, is what trait the child got. The same rules essentially apply to identity development, but instead of it being recessive and dominant traits, you have to look at exploration and commitment. Right? When it comes to development, especially development as a person, as an individual, your identity, it's exploration and commitment. All right, Tania, what is that? Exploration refers to like your level of interest or intentionality. And as it relates to like your beliefs, your values, and your perspectives, right? When I say your level of interest and intentionality, it means how curious are you about that thing and how actively are you searching? Okay, so how curious? So for example, for folks who are in like this space of what's my purpose, you would have a high level of exploration because you're thinking about it more. You're actively searching more, and you're a lot more curious than maybe you were 5 years ago. That means you have a high level of exploration, right? On the other side of that, you have commitment, right? And commitment refers to like your level of attachment to that belief, that value, or that perspective. Okay? So there's exploration versus commitment. And commitment is more so about like, how firm in that are you? So for example, when it comes to identity, there are certain parts of you that you own, right? You ever met a person who like, oh my gosh, I am my zodiac. So I'll use zodiac for an example. I know people who are obsessed with zodiac. They're like, I'm a Leo, which I'm a Leo. Oh, I'm a Leo. So these are my traits and I firmly believe in my zodiac. Those are people who are high in commitment and they're possibly low in exploration, right? Where there are some people who are like some of my zodiac, traits apply, but not all of them, right? They might be lower in commitment because they're not as attached to that idea. They're not as attached to that value, that belief, and that perspective, right? And so when it comes to development, it's really about how active you're searching to understand or to connect to that part of your identity and or your level of commitment to that particular aspect of your identity. Okay? Don't worry, I got you. Right? And so similar to like with that hereditary chart, you have your big T's and your little T's. Right? And so for both commitment and exploration, you have a big T. I'm using T because that's my name. We'll just use T for the sake of the conversation today, right? And so for exploration, you have little T and big T. And for commitment, you have little T and big T. Okay? And when you come, for each stage and in each section of each component of identity, you have a certain level that you live on. Mind you, these levels can flux, they can change, especially as you kind of step into who you are more and more. But essentially, in each of these, you have a certain level of exploration and a certain level of commitment. And depending on whether it's a big T or little T, for 2 determines which stage you are in. So for example, one of the very first, very elementary stages, and they usually equate this a lot to what it means to be a toddler or to be like a youth. Granted, most of this is associated with age and just like natural development, but all science will show you, all research will show you that it doesn't matter how old you are. That's why you hear terms like midlife crisis, because you can still have an identity crisis at a later age. So let's not limit it to age, but for the sake of this, it does refer to age. And so the first level, which is the elementary, like very, very much the first level, is called diffusion. And that's when you have a little t in both exploration and commitment. Okay? And so that means low exploration, low commitment. So for example, in this category, and folks who are in this stage in one of those self-identity areas, they aren't even thinking about it. People who have low commitment and low exploration. So for example, I mentioned to y'all earlier about how maybe you're in this space where you're questioning your purpose. Would you believe that there are some people out there who aren't questioning their purpose because they may not even believe or even know they have one? They just out here living to live, right? Kourtney Kardashian, I'm just living life, right? They are carefree. They're not thinking about a deeper meaning. Those are people who tend to be in diffusion. And so they say that most children, because children aren't thinking about the complexities of who they are just yet until they kind of get to grade school age. But when you're super young, you're just being, right? You're just living life. You're eating shit that you don't have no business eating. You know what I'm saying? You're deciding who you want to hold you, who you want to put you down. Like, you just living life, right? So you're very much on that very first stage of identity. That's just diffusion. Low level of exploration, low level of commitment. Okay? Then you have stage 2. And this is called foreclosure. And it refers to having low exploration and high commitment. This happens a lot, especially in African-American homes, and especially for things like religion and spirituality. Do you feel like, I guess I might want to ask or pose a question in this, but do you sometimes feel like you believe something and you don't fully know why you believe it? It's just that you can't imagine yourself believing anything else. You know, it's like, and so that's why I say, like, I feel like especially in Black homes, when it comes to, not all, I hate to stereotype, not all, but most, right? And that it happens a lot with religion and spirituality. For me, God has always existed. When I got to college and high school, I encountered people who were never exposed to religion or to God. But like, God is all I ever known. And so some would say, for most of my life, I was in this foreclosure space of, I accepted this belief and I have a strong, remember, commitment is like the level of attachment. I had this strong attachment to a thing that I never actually explored. Or it can be something as simple as, like, so I was just joking with a friend about this. Growing up, I always thought that it was illegal to have your inside car light on. Like, because whenever we turned the car light on, my mom would be like, turn it off. And so this whole time, I'm thinking that having your car light on inside the car is illegal. But it turns out it's just our Black moms being paranoid about people seeing in their car. Right? But it was a thing that I never really explored. I just accepted it as Bible. Right? And so many folks as it comes to identity and who you are, there are some areas where you've accepted some things as truth, as a belief, as a value, as a perspective, not because you actually believe it, but because you never did the exploration part. And so if you're in that space, that's a stage 2, and it's called foreclosure. It isn't bad, but again, the idea of full health and full wellness in these areas is you having that high level of attachment after you've explored. And so if you're in this area, it's not bad. And you might even find that even for me, there was a season where I did explore other religions, and I still ended up back with God because he's the only thing that's never forsaken me. Right? And so now I can say that I'm at a higher level as it relates to my spirituality because of that. Not a higher level than you, but a higher level than where I was, right? And so for those of you who are in the foreclosure area in any of those sections of your identity, it's totally fine. It just means that you have not explored enough, right? Which leads to stage 3, which is the opposite, right? That's when you have a big T in exploration, but a low T in commitment, right? And that's called moratorium, which is stage 3 or level 3 of development as it relates to your identity. Okay, and this is when there's no commitment there, or like there's either little to none of attachment to a thing, but you're constantly exploring, right? And so a great one for this one is looking at, like, sexuality, right? If you ever met somebody who's like sexually curious, where they'll just try anything, right? And I have friends and I have colleagues and I have people who I know who are like that. They're like, I'm not gay, I'm not straight, I like what I like, right? There are high levels of exploration, so they're actively seeking, actively searching, right? But there's no level of attachment, so they're not actually connecting with a thing. Also, not bad, right? But you want to get to a space where after you've explored, you come up with some sense. The people don't have to agree with it, right? So, like, again, as far as it relates to sexuality, there are going to be people in the world. It might be your parents, your loved ones, your friends, your colleagues who don't agree with what you've decided, as long as you have an attachment to something, right? And so people who are in that moratorium phase, they're high exploration, but they haven't sat down, they haven't committed. This is the stage where I mentioned, like, having a midlife crisis. So, like, let's not equate this just to being a teenager, right? Because this is happening a lot when you get to college, right? When you get to college and you're exposed to new people and new ideas, all of a sudden everything you thought that you knew, you're like, I don't know that no more, and now I want to go out and find it. Right? So it's common for somebody who's in like their late teenage years or in those college years who's high here. But also there can be someone who's a little bit older who's also in this space, right? Hence a midlife crisis. That's when out of nowhere someone gets exposed to a new idea. Remember those 3 E's, right? Your experience, your exposure, and your education, all the things that influence how you perceive your identity, right? Depending on which one of those you're exposed to, right? You start to explore new knowledge, a new idea of who you are. And that's true. I know even for me, I went through it in regards to my profession, right? I knew I wanted to go into education. I didn't think higher ed. I definitely didn't see me as a higher ed professional, or I definitely didn't see me as a college professor. But it wasn't until I was exposed to the different layers and avenues within education that I found a new path that I hadn't seen before, right? So again, not bad, but the goal is to always reach stage 4, which brings me to achievement. And that's when you have the big T in both. You have a high level of exploration and a high level of commitment. That means that you did your research, right? You actively sought, and you also made a healthy decision out of what's best for you to be attached to a certain value, a certain belief, a certain perspective. So for example, as it relates to my sexuality and my sexual orientation, right? And that, not that I've experimented like physically, but it is a thing that I've thought about of, well, okay, do I identify as a woman or a female? Why? Not just doing it because that's what the world tells me, but no, do I actually identify with being a female and a woman? Yes, I do. She, her, hers are my pronouns, right? But then also I'm naturally attracted to men, not because someone told me that I should or because I believe it's the right thing to do. It's because that after I did the exploration for myself, I went out and I looked into myself, I looked at the world, I decided that that's what's best for me. Right? And so again, to that same point, right, this idea of achievement is having those big T's, right? Capital T, is where you want to be in each component. So in self-knowledge, have you really explored to get to know things about you? Like, do you know where you're from? Do you know how your parents were brought up? Do you know, I know for me, I love asking my mom to tell me stories about my childhood because they're so revealing, and it's so exciting when you get to hear about things that your parents saw in you when you were younger, that they just now manifested into who you are as an adult, right? So I love those stories. My mom tells me that. So my thing is, have you done that research? Have you really explored? But also, do you know enough about you? And again, like, it's not always things that people can tell you, but it's just, are you actively doing the research? And are you actually making commitments to them? Right? Same for self-esteem and self-concept. Asking yourself, okay, well, how do I feel about this? Right? So for example, Father's Day is coming up. And I know this is a thing that even, again, year after year, this is the week where I'm constantly thinking about how fatherhood, or my lack thereof, has played a part in my life. If you're in that space, are you asking those questions, right? How do you interpret your father's place, or your father's lack thereof's place in your life, right? But also, not only how do you set that fact, but also how do you interpret it? How does it make you feel? How does it make you feel about you? And why? Right? Why do you feel that way? So when I realized, it made me feel like I wasn't worthy. Why? Because he left me. Right? And when someone leaves you, you assume that because they left, they didn't want to be here. Right? And so I'm connecting all the dots, and I had to, that's how you unlearn, how you rewire. It's hard to rewire if you don't know where the wires are coming from. Right? So part of that exploration doesn't always mean doing research and reading books and seeking counselors and guidance. Sometimes it's just asking yourself those hard questions. Right? Again, going back to asking yourself the hard questions. And as you're asking the hard questions, when you get to those answers that really resonate with you, that make you feel whole, that's when you start entering that area of achievement. Right? And so, and I think I'm a firm believer of all the components. Once you, again, it starts with you. So before you can start attacking that area of social self and how you show up with people, you have to first look at that self-knowledge, that self-concept, and self-esteem. I think once you have those levels of achievement, and you reach that achievement stage in those areas, I think then you can put that focus and prioritize social self. But it's hard to start with the external you, right? Your attitudes and your behaviors and your interactions if you don't know why you do what you do. So for example, one thing that I'm working on this season is just being more vulnerable in relationships, right? And so it started off with me understanding, why am I not vulnerable? And so I've been in this space of asking myself this question of, okay, well, Tania, why do you have challenges communicating with people about this? Why do you, and for some people, and it's so funny, my mom says that when I was younger, that God told her that I was inquisitive. And to let me continue to ask questions, because there was always just a why. Like, I'm a firm believer there's a why to everything, and I'm going to ask it. That was me when I was younger, and even me now, which is why I love the research that I get to do with my job, but also I love being a coach because I get to ask the questions why all day. And so for some people, it might seem like I'm always asking why, but because of that, I'm able to achieve higher levels of identity and acceptance, And so even for you, if you're in that space of asking yourself, well, asking why, it's great that you're asking why. Just, I think you're asking the wrong people. Nobody else can tell you why. You tell you why. He tells you why through you, and that's hard. Like, again, that's nuancy. You got to think that's not only is it, so it's self-concept, which has 4 parts. Right? Plus, in those 4 parts, right, you have the past, the present, and the future you, right? Which makes it now 12 parts, because you got 3 within each 4. And then in each of those 12s, you have different levels and different stages. That's a big, big bunch of boxes. It's a lot of boxes to figure out. And so it's not easy. And so I love this. And I think, again, one of those things that really helps you experience and accept and to give grace is when you understand that it takes a lifetime to fill in those boxes. I could give y'all a chart right now and says, okay, fill in your level of commitment and exploration in all these categories. Tell me what you know about you. Tell me how you feel about you. Tell me I can tell you, I'll ask you all that. It would take you a lifetime to fully complete that. Because even, again, that back to one of my first statements in this podcast episode of we're also still experiencing life. So while you're asking yourself these questions, you're also changing, right? Religion and spirituality, what it meant to me 10 years ago is not what it means to me now. Right? And so as you're evolving, you have to constantly go back and ask yourself, okay, is this a big T or little T for me? Right? Where am I as far as my development in this area? What questions should I be asking me? You know? And it's layered. It's layered. It's nuanced. And so how do you give yourself grace? That's really hard, especially when I think about us living in a society where we value and we crave instant gratification, right? This idea of being an overnight success, you know, and with the scrolling and constantly seeing it and it seeming like it's happening for everyone else a lot faster than it's happening for you, it can sometimes pressure you into skipping steps. You know, I can't remember if I mentioned this like last week, but I love to use the analogy of like an IKEA bookshelf, you know, and don't act like you ain't never went to IKEA. You know, damn well you got you a $30 bookshelf, dresser, bed in the bag. You know. But I think the one frustrating thing about IKEA is that while it looks good and it's cheap, they are hard to build, right? And you see the picture on the box and you're like, I want that. And it seems simple enough. You know what I'm saying? But when you open the box and you see all the parts and the instructions don't make no sense, you be like, oh, shit. What did I get into? You know? And so because you don't understand the instructions and you don't want to go the extra mile of really understanding it, we just go with our gut. And we just build it based off of our experiences, right? And then you wonder why when you finish the bookshelf, it's lopsided and you got all these extra parts. Like, dang, why did they give me so many nails? Because you had to use them, baby. You know? And then we're wondering why that bookshelf breaks a month later or it doesn't actually last as long as we want it to last, right? I think just like with that IKEA bookshelf, the same thing applies to us. We have these pictures, right? We get so attached to where we see ourselves being, where we want to be. And because we want to get there so fast, we're just throwing things together and we're hoping that it works out. And then we're left wondering, why the hell do I have all these parts that are outside of my body, that are outside of me? You know? And that can be challenging. And so, as always, you know, I'm always encouraging folks to think about this. Think about it deeper, especially in this time. I think it's so, so powerful to set time aside for silence. I saw this tweet and it resonated with me so much. And it was saying like that sometimes the peace that you want is a piece of silence. Right? We want to have the answers to this question, but we're trying to ask them in like a subway station. It's like, you don't hear all these trains. You got people yelling. You got trains flying past you. It's like, you can't hear for real. Right? And so many a times the question that you want to ask, you're probably asking the right questions in the right season, but maybe you aren't making the space for it to actually hear. You know, and so my homework to folks this week is taking the time. Take the time this week, right? Those 12 boxes, right? So thinking about the self-concept, those 4 boxes, and the past, present, and future you. I want you to start. And if you can, and stay tuned. I'm going to have something for y'all to play around with next week. But for this week, when you get a chance, just get a blank piece of paper, get a dry erase board and some markers or a pen and a notepad, and just draw out those 12 boxes and start filling them in. Who am I? Right? Self-knowledge. What do I know about me? What have I accepted as fact about me? Right? Self-concept. Now that I know these things about me, how have I interpreted them over the years? Or how do I interpret them now? Self-esteem. How do I feel about me? How do I feel about what I know? And then lastly, how does what I know, what I feel, and what I think show up in my social interactions, in that social self? And I think when you're doing that, it's layers to awareness. And when you're doing that, of don't just pick out the bad things, right? You'll find that in that you're like, huh, I didn't realize that I felt that way about me. Good shit to me. And then some things you might go, oh man, I shouldn't be thinking that about me. I gotta unlearn that. And then we start to unlearn it. But the fact of the matter is that just you thinking about it, just you getting into the art of practicing it will be clearer for you, right? And if you want to go an extra, so in your self-concept, do you feel like you are big T or little t as it relates to commitment and exploration? It's layered. You're not going to have all the answers. It's not going to all make sense. But just start. Start thinking about it. Start writing it down. Keep it close. If you're going to have it on paper, keep it close. Don't do it all. I love reflection. I love these exercises. But the great thing about them is that you could always come back to it. So give yourself time. So we got, 7 days this week? You got 12 boxes. Like, just do 2 boxes a day. 2 boxes a day. You know, hey, I want to just look at or 3. Hey, I want to look at the past, present, and future me today as it relates to self-concept. And just write down what you think you know. All right? But again, that idea of the boxes, the levels, and the layers, it's a lot. So more importantly this week, give yourself grace. Give yourself grace for what you didn't know. Give yourself grace for what you don't know now. And give yourself grace for what you're going to unlearn in the future, because it's going to be. This happens. There are things that I believe in now that if you ask me 10 years from now, I probably don't. And that's okay. Right? Because again, you are custom. And when he called you to purpose, when he called you to what he called you to, he factored in who you were, who you weren't, all your mistakes. And that's all that matters. All right? So with that, you know. I love you. Call me back.